Now we're going to actually get into the real install. And first we're going to download and install Docker. We're going to tweak some of the settings of it, or check them out at least. And then we're going to go clone my repo. We're going to get an editor in case you don't have a code editor. And then we are checking out a few options. If you want to tweak your terminal and your shell setup, we can get to that too. Okay, so here's my plain old Windows 10 Pro machine. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to store.docker.com. And I'm going to click on Docker CE here in the middle. And then Docker Community Edition for Windows. Now in here, you'll notice that by default when I click the Get Docker, it's going to download the Docker for Windows. It says this requires Windows 10 Professional. If I had an older version of Windows that we'll show in a few minutes, I would click on the Docker toolbox. But here I'm going to say Get Docker. And by default, by the way, this is installing the stable edition, not the Edge. If I wanted Edge, I could scroll down a little farther and I could choose Edge. Or if I was actually on the server version, I could actually do the Edge there as well. Let's save this. I personally save it before I run it because it seems to work better that way. And then we're going to run the install. And the install is pretty typical for Windows. It's going to ask me if it's okay. Now that it's installed, you notice it's not running. I would see a little Moby icon down there. So let me actually run it. And it's going to ask me about Hyper-V. So if you don't have Hyper-V installed on your machine, then this will actually enable it and reboot. Now that means you have to have local admin. I mean, you had to have local admin to install this thing. And you're going to have local admin for Hyper-V. If you're on a laptop or desktop that you've never done virtualization on, there's a rare case that you may need to go in the BIOS and actually enable the virtualization features in the BIOS. And that's well documented on the internet. If you have an error, I recommend just looking at the error up on the internet, and you'll probably will find that everyone's saying, oh yeah, go in your BIOS and find the extensions and install the VTX extension or whatever it is in the BIOS. You're not actually installing it, you're actually just enabling it. But that's a rare case. Most of the time, people that have problems installing, it's either because they're on a home edition, but they forgot to check and they thought they had Pro, so they try to install the Pro version. Or maybe they're running an older version of Windows 10 that doesn't have the latest updates. It is important that you keep your Windows machine up to date for Docker because Windows is updating their stuff as rapidly as Docker's updating theirs, and they're both related. So you definitely want to keep those. You can actually now see on my machine, I've rebooted and Docker is starting in this little icon down at the bottom. Once it's booted, then I'll see this little prompt, and I can run my PowerShell as me, not as admin, but just as me, and I can do a Docker version. And I should see it running. And this is the version I have installed. This is the latest stable version. And in case you were so inclined, in the background this is running Hyper-V. So I can run the Hyper-V desktop app, and I can actually see on my desktop that this is running in something called a Moby Linux VM. And it's got 2 gig of RAM installed, and its uptime is just a minute because it just started. So real quick, let's just go into the settings, right click on that little icon down there, and we'll go up here to settings. And there's a couple that you need to care about. If you store your code that you might use in this course on a different drive, you're going to need to check that here. I definitely am going to check C because that's where I keep a lot of my code. So I need to enable wherever I'm going to have code running inside a container. You'll see more about that later, but you got to do that here. And the other thing is you might, if you want, if you have enough resources, you can always bump up the memory or the CPUs. I think it comes pretty cool out of the box. I mean, 2 gig and 2 CPUs is a pretty good amount. But if you start hitting it limits and it starts to get slow, you can always bump those up depending on your hardware, right? And the rest of these options, you're kind of leave the same probably. You're not going to have to mess with those too much in this course. But when I apply these settings, it will require restarting of Docker. And while that's happening, let's go clone my repo. And remember that this is in the resource lecture earlier in this section. Now, I'm going to clone this, but I want to clone it in desktop. If you've never used GitHub before, then you can use a GUI, and that's probably one of the easiest ways if you're not used to GitHub. If you know GitHub, then you got your own way to do it. But here, what I can do is I can actually use the GitHub GUI to download and clone my repo. So I'm going to install that. All right, and then I'm actually going to put all of my code in a directory called code. So I'm going to make a directory. So you'll see on my machine that I actually put all of my software code inside a directory called code underneath my user. So that's where I'm going to clone this from GitHub at. And if you remember earlier, I just changed the settings so that the C drive could be where I store some code that Docker can see. So I'm just going to log in as me. Okay, now that I have GitHub installed, one of the ways I can clone it is from the website. I can copy the URL, then go back over to desktop and say clone a repository, copy that in. And then remember, I wanted to, this is not going to be under documents, it's going to be under code. That's where I put my stuff. So clone. Now the advantage of doing it this way instead of downloading the zip is that you can come in here and update it, because I do update this repo when there's fixes or changes in Docker, which happens pretty much every month. So now if I do a dir in here, you can see that I'm in the Docker, the Udemy Docker mastery directory, and there we go. Now, if you're not savvy on code editors, a little tip here is the best one I like for Docker editing is Visual Studio Code. You can just search VS Code, and you'll get the website coming right up, and then you can download it and install it just like a regular Windows app. And it works quite well. One of the best parts about this editor is that it has built-in Docker syntax. So it'll let me open up Docker Compose files and Docker files, as you'll learn in this course, and it'll highlight the code in them and give me actual little hints about how to use it. The other option is if you want to replace this window, right? So this PowerShell window is a terminal emulator, not the same as the shell that's inside it, because we still have to use the PowerShell shell. But what we can use is a different GUI for that shell, and that might be commander.net. And Commander is basically a console emulator that gives you a huge amount of features for free, open source, out of the box. And the way I install it is I just download it. It's a zip file, and I actually make sure that, by the way, when you do this, you right click, go to properties, and unblock so that you can actually unzip it, and then it works. It doesn't complain to you. All right, now that I've extracted the Commander, I'm just going in here and I'm going to drag the Commander button down here. The commander.exe is actually what that is. I'm just going to drag that down to my start menu, or my taskbar rather, and that way I can launch it from here. And the first time it's going to do some stuff. It's going to set up some things. Notice that it's actually got a tab down here, and I can create more tabs. And I can do that over here. This little drop down menu, there's actually several of them here. This one allows me to decide what my next tab is going to run as. Is it going to run Bash? Is it going to run PowerShell? Or is it going to run the command prompt? Well, I remember I told you earlier, we need to run this as PowerShell. So we're going to be in here, and then we're going to type in Docker PS, and the way we go, Docker info works. And you'll learn about these commands all in a minute, but the point is it kind of just works out of the box, but it's a neat option, and I tend to run it whenever I'm using Windows.